everybody, and welcome to the latest Insights Intelligence briefing from At Risk International's Global Risk Intelligence team. I'm Ross Hill, Director of Intelligence, and with me today I have one of our protective intelligence analysts, Roman Fisher. Our first story today is the mass protests and strikes that are going on in Israel. They're being held against controversial judicial reforms planned by the government, where it wants to take control over the committee which appoints judges, including those to the Supreme Court. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the changes will stop courts overreaching their powers, but the changes are being criticised as being undemocratic, and that they would also help Netanyahu in his ongoing trial for corruption, and also help the far-right and nationalist parties currently involved in the government coalition take control of the judicial system. Protests have actually been going on for a few weeks now, but the latest was triggered by Netanyahu sacking the defence minister after he criticised the government's planned reforms. The strikes and protests are very well supported, and that's including by the military, which is influential in the country. So as far as strikes go, departures are currently suspended from Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion Airport. Some airlines are also cancelling incoming flights because of the unrest. Also, the two main seaports have closed, and Israeli embassies globally have been told by trade unions to stop work. Seeing some media speculation that Netanyahu will pause or stop the planned changes, but that's actually politically quite difficult for him. Some of the coalition partners in the government and their supporters are continuing to really push quite hard for the changes to go ahead. So if it is paused, then there is a risk of the government coalition collapsing. But if it's not stopped, then very likely that those mass protests and associated strikes will continue. Now we're seeing that some nationalist groups are planning counter-protests. That increases the risk of violence and unrest. It looks like there'll be some rival protests planned in Jerusalem tonight. And there's at least one video on social media of a car apparently being driven deliberately at protesters. Netanyahu is calling for calm, as well as some others. But the government coalition isn't particularly popular at the moment. So if the protests do achieve their aim and the planned changes to the judicial system are cancelled, then there's actually a risk that the protests will become a bit more broadly anti-government. And so generally what we're looking at is an increased risk of unrest and government collapse in Israel. For our next one, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, otherwise known as START, at the University of Maryland, they released a research brief called Profiles on Individual Radicalization in the United States. Released that at the beginning of May, and it covers data up to the end of 2021. The START research found that since 2016, there's been a significant increase in far-right extremism in the US. I think, that's something that's probably quite well known. But something that is a bit more interesting is the data show that on average, far-right extremists tend to be older, have lower rates of college experience and higher rates of military experience, as well as involvement in crime prior to their radicalization. This in comparison to other extremists, such as the far left, who are typically younger and more likely to be well-educated. Most of the far right express some kind of white supremacist or nativist extremism. And then what we've seen kind of go concurrently with that is an increase in the number of anti-fascist and anarchist extremists, which you might expect to emerge in opposition to those extreme right groups. The data from START also confirms that the greatest risk is from lone individuals rather than kind of complex coordinated attacks, although that risk still remains. But I think one of the most interesting things that comes out of the research is that the time from becoming radicalized to actually carrying out some kind of extremist crime has decreased. In 2007, about 20% went from radicalization to some kind of attack in less than a year. But in 2021, this was nearly 50% for overall within all the extremist groups they looked at. It's about 45% in the far right and about 56% in the far left. So that window to preventing attacks is becoming shorter. That is being linked to online radicalization. But I also think the type of lone actor attacks that we see, which take less planning and coordination, obviously can increase the speed at which someone is able to act. And then we're probably entering a period of increased risk at the moment with Trump's potential arrest, sort of imminently, and then the elections next year. And now I'll hand you over to Roman Fisher.
Thank you, Ross. Seeking to understand hard right social media, or HRSM, activity and its impact on society and politics and the potential lead up to civil unrest, researchers published a new study that will appear in the April 2023 issue of the American Psychological Review. The purpose of the research was to provide some clarity on the issue, as past studies have had mixed results. According to the new study, HRSM activity increased subsequent unrest in the United States during 2020. The research shows that a 10% increase in HRSM activity predicts a 0.04% increase in the number of hard right civil unrest events. Additionally, researchers found statistical evidence that social media can shift people's understanding of social norms, and that users can start to view civil unrest as more acceptable. In other words, HRSM activity can lead users to be more willing to organize in-person rallies and more accepting of behavior that leads to civil unrest. Researchers collected civil unrest event data from January 2020 through January 2021. And they gathered it from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, better known as ACLED, and the Crowd Counting Consortium. They also collected activity data from sites like Parler, and they collected that from across the US in 2020. The researchers differentiated HRSM platforms from alt-social media like Gab and Mastodon. Although similar, HRSM sites contain primarily conservative social and political content. And as Parler no longer exists, many have moved onto platforms like Chan and Winboards and Telegram. Truth Social is likely to draw a measure of HRSM activity if and when it becomes available in the US. And lastly, the report claims that hard right social media platforms are becoming more popular among political right and generating billions of investment dollars. Although the new research shows that HRSM activity has a marginal impact on civil unrest, it does offer some value for security professionals in determining the likelihood of civil unrest when HRSM is heightened. And that's what we have for you this week. We do hope you found the information insightful and valuable, and we hope to present to you again in the near future. Thank you.